Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. It looks like we have a good number of folks who have joined us already, so thank you all for being here. Once again, my name is Laura Allen. I'm the National Organizer for Generation 180. And I'm so glad that you all have made time in your busy days in this holiday season to join us and learn more about clean energy storage. So now before I begin, I'd like to set all of your minds at ease, and especially the folks who are just joining us. You are on mute and your cameras will not be utilized, but we do encourage audience participation. So please use the questions box in the GoToWebinar drop-down menu and type your questions. We will address them at the end of the presentation. Now, for those of you who are new to Generation 180, welcome, welcome. We're glad to have you here. We are a national nonprofit that is dedicated to accelerating the transition to clean energy. We work with communities and individuals across the country to support the implementation of clean energy practices. If you'd like to learn more about our work, please visit our website at generation180.org. Okay, so today we will be discussing energy storage with Corey Ramsden of Solar United Neighbors. Solar United Neighbors envisions a clean, equitable energy system that directs control and benefits back to local communities. They are a national nonprofit organization that is dedicated to representing the needs and interests of solar owners and clean energy supporters. Solar United Neighbors does a great deal of work on policy issues that increase access to energy, and their website is an excellent primer on all of the subjects that touch solar, from low-income programs to net metering and navigating the install process. I highly recommend that you check out their site. I know for me it's been an amazing resource. So if you're interested in learning more, the solarunitedneighbors.org website is really excellent for learning about the issues and learning about how to install solar on your own home or encourage it in your community. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker, Corey Ramsden. Corey is the Vice President of Go Solar Programs with Solar United Neighbors. He develops, deploys, and scales educational materials and on-the-ground project models for rooftop solar, community solar, battery storage, and electric vehicle charging. He is a NABCEP-certified PV technical sales professional and a graduate of Loyola University Maryland in Baltimore. Corey, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Laura. I appreciate the invitation.
Let me go ahead and hand the screen over to you.
Well, thank you again, and thanks to Generation 180 for extending the invitation. Hello, everybody out there. We're going to be going through a number of slides today talking about energy storage from a couple different perspectives. I'm probably going to go somewhat quickly just to make sure we get through everything, and there's a chance for questions at the end, especially on the technology stuff on the front. But as Laura said, feel free to chat the questions that you have, and we're happy to answer those at the end of the session if we don't cover anything that you wanted to learn about. So we're going to dive right in here. As you probably have seen through the news, there's a lot of media coverage out there about storage, everything from new equipment on the market to big installations that are happening to how solar and storage fit together in places where there's a lot of solar. So we're going to go through some of that today, but really what the starting point for us is giving folks a kind of a base on how storage works in the residential context, talking a little bit about the economics, and then touching on what it looks like at a larger scale as it applies to the grid, and some of the ideas of equity that we are starting to think about with respect to storage in particular that we want to introduce to you, and then a little bit at the end on resources before we jump into questions. So let's get started on the storage part. First and foremost, so people have a picture in their mind, when you've got solar on your roof, for example, the common system there is that it's grid tied, and that system is going to, in the absence of any sort of place to store the energy locally, that system is going to shut off when the grid goes down. And that's primarily for safety reasons. They don't want the system injecting electricity into the grid while people are fixing it. So if you want to run your house off when the grid is out and you have solar, you're either going to be installing a battery system, or you might install or have a fossil fuel generator. But if you have those things, you can run some of your house on when the grid is out. If you don't, even if you have solar, your system is going to be out until the grid comes back. across the country, really important concept up front is that in most markets, and we'll talk about the economics of when this is not true, in most markets, people who are installing backup power through storage are really doing it because they're trying to provide some resiliency for their home. It is, in most cases right now in the US, not a way to make money like you would if you were installing solar and you're offsetting your electricity costs. Those batteries are there to jump into action if you lose grid electricity. And just to be clear, we're talking about systems that are connected to the grid, that get grid service, that might lose power, and not what they call off-grid, where a system is not connected to the electricity grid at all. That's a pretty different subject, and in most cases involves a kind of a different sizing process that people go through there. Certainly, very good way to bring electricity to a home that's doesn't have utility service. But for the context of this conversation, we're talking about grid-tied battery backup systems. As I mentioned earlier briefly, battery backup systems in the home context are really an alternative to generators. In many cases, a fossil fuel power generator is going to be an economic source of a way to back up your home. But we like to think of battery backup as not only a way to provide backup services, but as you'll see down the line in this presentation, other services as well. And best of all, when you're pairing it with solar, the fuel for that backup power is coming from the sun. You are able to recharge those batteries when the power is out and run potentially indefinitely if you've sized that system to meet all the needs in your home. And we'll go into that a little bit more in a couple of slides. One thing we get questions for a lot is how do people size these systems? Up front, the main message is your installer is going to work with you to do that. And it really comes down to what you want to power in your home when you don't have grid power. And they're going to do that two different ways. There's two terms that folks should be familiar with. They often get interchanged, but they're really important in the context of storage. One is energy. That's what your system, solar array, or your battery system is producing over time in the form of kilowatt hours. And the other term is power, and that's what it is able to do at any particular moment. So just to give you kind of a brief example, power is going to be the factor that determines whether you can run every appliance in your house all at the same time versus running one at a time. Those two factors get put together by the installer, a conversation with the homeowner about what they want to back up in their home when the power is out, and obviously budget and other considerations get factored in there as well. So important to keep those two terms in mind. As I said, they get used interchangeably, but they really are different, and they factor into how a system is sized for a home or any application. So what can we power with batteries? The short answer is pretty much anything you want in your home. It's mostly a function of how much you want to pay and what you really think is important when the power is out. So that's part of that sizing process that you would go through with a qualified installer. What's happening is you're connecting those loads to a separate panel that's part of your electric system at home. But when the power goes out, as you can see on this little diagram here, that part of the system continues to run, gets powered by batteries with some extra equipment involved, and the rest of the house might be off, but you're still running your TV, you might be running some lights, maybe a small refrigerator, loads of that nature, but potentially not your whole home. Just another example here, you can see the picture on the left is actually an installation from one of our employees that works down in Florida. And you can see there, it's essentially wired directly to that sub panel. And everything in the home that they power runs in there. And when the power's out, that's the panel that is operating, and it's being charged or being powered by that battery system on the left. Just a small example, just to kind of give you a sense of how this fits together. Depending on the size of the battery bank, and there are different sizes out there available that installers would offer and size for you. But just for this small example, you can see here, it's not enough power to power the entire home in this situation. You're picking loads that are important, maybe a small appliance or two, some lights, some convenience devices, potentially a wall-powered air conditioning unit. That's often popular in southern climates. People are trying to do battery power. They may not power their entire air conditioning system for their house. They may just power a single wall unit in an important room in their house for them to be able to get a more cost-effective solution and still maintain some comfort if the grid power is not available. So coming back to this solar and storage, perfect mix, chocolate and peanut butter. Solar is powering the storage when solar and storage are powering your home together when it's grid tied, but when the power goes out, that solar really is the fuel for storage. So during the daytime, those panels are powering loads in your home, and they're also topping off those batteries. At nighttime, the batteries kick in, and they're being used to power the home in the event of an outage. So as long as your battery size matches the things you're using in the home during that outage, you can potentially run for days and days and days with the solar powering that battery backup over and over again. One thing we like to jump into here, and this often confuses people, but as a consumer, we think organization, we think it's important for people to really understand some of the terms that they're going to hear if they're thinking about storage. So these two terms here, this AC coupled and DC coupled, this is in reference to how the storage connects to your home. So systems that are DC coupled, the storage is actually on the same side of the brains of the system, or what we call the inverter, and that is on the same side as the solar modules. So it's providing DC electricity from the solar modules and from the batteries, and they're both connected to the inverter, which then provides AC energy to the house. In the AC coupled version, that battery has a separate inverter that's supplying electricity directly to the house, and then there's another piece of equipment, another inverter that's powering the solar array. So just to give you kind of a picture in your head, the analogy we like to say is that an AC coupled, DC coupled system is really when your solar and your batteries are holding hands, right? They're hanging out together. But an AC coupled system, they're kind of just waving at each other from across the hall. That's also, both of these are possible. Your installer is going to tell you which one is probably the right one for you, and the requirements for sizing them are going to vary, but we just want to make sure folks understand that there's some variations there, and you've got options whether you have solar installed already or whether you're doing solar and storage at the same time. You will see a couple different technologies out on the market. As you can see here, the old tried and true one is lead acid, so you'll still see systems being sized with lead acid batteries. They have generally a shorter lifespan, but also a lower cost. The majority, and this is where most of our discussions will be today, is around the newer technology, which is the lithium ion. And that's what is common in Tesla batteries and LG and a lot of the ones that you've probably seen marketing for. And they have a higher density, they take up less space, they come at a higher cost right now, but they also have a longer lifespan and have some additional flexibility in terms of where they can be sited in some cases, depending on the model in terms of outside or inside. So again, just terms for people to be aware of and knowing what options are out there if you're looking for storage. As I mentioned earlier, in terms of space, the battery backup systems the size is gonna vary on how much you're backing up, of course. So if you have to add additional capacity, you're gonna need more room. But you just got a couple of pictures here as far as what these systems might look like. The lead acid ones are often kind of connected together in small increments to make a bigger system. The storage lithium ion ones on the right, there's a Tesla example, but the other ones are similar. You're using a box of a prepackaged box where you might connect one or two together, but it's not quite as modular as in some cases, as you'll see with lead acid. That's not always true. There are some lithium ion ones that are modular, but this just gives you kind of a sense of the different size and space requirements. As I mentioned earlier, in terms of siting, there are some variations there. So in places like Florida or warmer climates, the installer may make a different choice about where to site that. But the different manufacturers do have different requirements, including amongst lithium ion batteries, as far as where they can go. So in some cases, that unit might be outside on maybe a shady wall, or it might need to be inside because they think they're going to get better performance from it in that location. One other thing we like to make sure people understand is just the idea of maintenance and the length, a lifespan of these systems. So as I mentioned briefly earlier, lithium ion has a longer lifespan than a lead acid battery in most cases, sealed or flooded lead acid. And that lifespan is typically going to be 10 years. The number of cycles refers to how often it's charged or discharged in this slide here. And it varies a little bit by manufacturer, but roughly speaking, the batteries are expected to last 10 years when they're cared for properly. And they can also be discharged, in most cases, almost fully and recharged. So they have a pretty wide swing of how much energy you can use from it at a given time, as opposed to a lead acid battery, where you're probably able to draw less of it from any particular charge cycle because they need to have a certain level of charge in order to stay healthy. So those, again, are things your installer is going to work through with you. And it's important when you're talking to an installation company to understand what their warranties are for those installations and whether they're going to take care of any sort of maintenance costs should something need to be serviced, or if that's something that gets covered outside of whatever warranty the manufacturer has. Some other considerations here. This is kind of a catch-all for us, but we do think it's important for people to know that there are some other pieces and parts to this puzzle that are a little unclear depending on where you are in the country, because battery systems are so new, especially in the residential context. One thing we always tell people when they are going solar, and the same is true for batteries, is if you're thinking about installing storage, it's a good idea to call your insurance company, explain what you're doing, understand whether there's going to be any impact to your rates based on the equipment you're adding, and also if there are any differences based on where that equipment is. So just for example, in the case of storage, if the system is going to be located outside, that might have a different impact on your insurance than if it's installed within the living space. It's relatively early days, so we don't have a lot of background yet or information about how that looks for insurance companies, but it is a good idea, as I said, to call and check. These next items here, permitting and utilities requirements, these are going to vary by jurisdiction. For backup power, which is what we're talking about in most parts of the country, the system is being disconnected from the grid while those batteries are running and using their energy. So in most cases, there should not be an issue, but local jurisdictions, their laws are going to and rules are going to vary, and the utilities will as well in terms of what approval processes are required. And because it's relatively new, it's a good idea to ask your installer about what they expect through that process and whether or not they've had any challenges in the past, or even how many systems they've installed previously in your area. So just like you would with any other contractor, gauging what their qualifications are and what the level of experience they have with these technologies and installing them around you. And this last piece here is something you may have seen, may not have seen in the news, which is equipment availability. One thing that we ran into recently, which we've experienced, especially in the Florida area, but in other markets as well, is just equipment shortages for storage. So when you have a lot of demand, the manufacturing supply is still ramping up across different manufacturers, you may see various levels of availability or lack of availability. One example we ran into in Maryland for one of the groups we did a storage co-op, so like a bulk purchase for solar and storage together, and some folks just installed storage. The company that was offering that couldn't actually get the units, even though they thought they could, because those units were actually the central pieces of them, those lithium-ion batteries, were actually being used by EV, electric vehicle manufacturers. So a lot of the same technologies are being used in both spaces, and that sometimes can impact availability as well. Just like with these other items, good idea to ask your installer what the availability is and what their timelines are for getting this equipment for you. Next, we're going to jump into the economics of storage a little bit. We do want folks to have a sense of what these costs are. I will start off by saying the economics vary quite a bit across different technologies and even across manufacturers. The important thing is to just understand how the different costs break out, and that when you're looking at your storage options, that you really are accounting for all of these categories. So what you can see here, we've broken it down into 3 sections. A lot of times if you're looking at some marketing or some information from a manufacturer, they're going to be talking about their hardware cost. And that's fine, and that we see that ranges from 6 to 10,000. It could be more in some situations depending on the size of system you're getting, but that's a rough range that we've seen so far, and that's for the equipment itself. There's also the cost of installation, and that involves all the things that we've just talked about in terms of getting the permits and designing it, coming on site, programming the system to make sure that it works properly with your home. So there's even more so than solar, which is pretty straightforward in terms of setup. Storage often requires some settings changes and things like that by the installer. So there's some customization that they'll have to do to make sure it works for your home. And that's about 3,000 to 5,000 that we've seen. It's going to vary by market. And then this last bucket of maintenance is really a catch-all, but it's meant to just acknowledge that your system, battery backup systems are still relatively new. There might be some follow-up calls or questions or things that you might need to have with the installer, or a setting change that might need to be made, and that potentially has a cost to it, as well as any sort of parts replacement. Keep in mind as well, these systems, so if you're pairing it with solar, your solar array is going to last from 20 to 25 years. Your storage array is not going to last that long. It's probably going to be in the neighborhood of 10 years, as those warranties are saying. So if you're thinking long-term, you do want to account for the fact that you're probably going to need to replace that pack. By then, costs are probably going to be a lot lower, but we do think it's important for people to understand that the length of time varies from the length of the solar array that it might be paired with. Now that we're back on economics, do want to just make this point again about this really being about backup power in most markets. Now, there are parts of the country where solar penetration is high enough that the rules that the state utilities and regulators have put in place allow storage to actually have an economic value, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But for most parts of the country, if you're adding backup power, you're really creating resiliency, adding resiliency value to your home through backup, and not necessarily any sort of economic value for the cost of the electricity. There are some incentives that are out there. Some of them are state-based. The one that is federal is the federal tax credit that's for solar. There was a ruling that was released and some clarity provided in terms of how this applies when solar is paired with storage, or storage is paired with solar rather. You can take that 30% federal tax credit in assuming that those batteries are charged fully from solar. From 75 down to 75%, it's incremental. So if 75% of the batteries are charged from solar and the rest is coming from your utility grid, that would be the amount. It's kind of hard to verify that, but that's something you want to kind of go through with your installer. Make sure you understand whether or not your system that they're designing for you will qualify for that tax credit as part of the solar tax credit. And I will mention here, from an advocacy perspective, there is a push that's happening over the next year or so, I think, to introduce a separate storage tax credit, which would liberate the installation of storage from having to be tied to this solar tax credit. And if that goes through, that should have a pretty strong effect on the market and people's ability to install storage afterwards or in other contexts, and not have it necessarily be tied specifically to this particular solar-based credit. So let's get into some of the specifics of how, now that we've talked about it from a backup perspective and some of the technology, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking through these next couple slides. These are can be a little bit confusing for folks, and I want to make sure that we cover them in detail. So this picture you're looking at here is a representation of what something like a demand charge might be used for. And for folks that aren't familiar with it, a demand charge is really the utility saying, we're going to charge our customers for a certain amount of power that is used in the course of a month. So the highest point, in often cases, or sometimes it's a range of power that you're demanding from the utility at any given point. We see this charge a lot in businesses. So manufacturers or large-scale companies, they're often going to have a demand charge in addition to paying for kilowatt hours. So their bills are a combination of how much power they've requested, the spike or the maximum there, in the course of a billing period, and how many kilowatt hours they used over the course of that billing period. What we're starting to see is that in some cases, those demand charges are starting to be applied to residential customers as well, or being increased. So what you're looking at here is really a representation of how storage can impact or create savings when those demand charges are there. So let's say, for example, you have solar on your roof and you're installing storage because you have a high demand charge in your utility. Let's say, for example, they've had a lot of solar, and for whatever reason, they've decided to pass this and try to slow down the growth of solar potentially, or maybe just to acknowledge that there's more demand on their resources than they think they can handle. Whether they can or not, and all of that's kind of a separate question, which I'm happy to talk about at the end, but these charges are coming up. And in this particular situation, if you look at these examples, those yellow peaks are times during the month when you used a lot of electricity all at once. So a space heater has a big demand for power at a given point to be able to provide warmth in the house. Same thing for appliances like microwaves and dryers, as in this example. And those spikes in this graph are above the line at which they might charge you additional for demanding more power from your utility. Where storage comes in is that during those time periods, storage can actually provide the power instead of the utility and keep you below that flat level that is probably on your bill as a regular charge, no matter how much electricity you use. So that's just one example of how storage is, in this situation, is impacting your bill directly. It's saying, instead of getting hit with these charges, the storage unit is going to take over and do it for you, and your house is not going to actually use that service from the utility. It's going to use it from the batteries instead. And the batteries will be smart enough, along with its other equipment, to be able to step in and do that. It's very complex software that does that, but that is one role for storage, and it does this already in many cases in business settings, and we're probably going to see this start to happen more and more in residential settings as well. In some parts of the country, that's already starting to happen. The other type of policy where storage provides some economic value is something called time of use. So in this situation, over the course of a day, so this chart is referencing a single day as opposed to a month, which is the previous chart. So this chart was over the course of a month, and this is just a single day snapshot. Time of use, as you might guess by its name, is saying that at certain times of the day, electricity is going to be more expensive or less expensive. And it's typically gauged to when the utility, or at least should be, when the utility is paying more or has a higher cost of delivering that electricity. The idea being that they want to encourage people to use electricity in areas where it costs less, and times when it costs less, and discourage people from using it when it costs more. So they, rather than having a single price for the entire pay period, entire month, they have a varied price. In the evening, so this yellow period on the right here would be a period of high cost. It's in the evening. There, in some parts of the country, that's often a peak time of electricity usage during the day. So they might charge more for electricity during that time period. With storage, during the daytime, you're generating solar energy, you're powering part of your home from that, or maybe all of it, and you're also filling up those batteries. If you had a time of use tariff or a time of use plan that you were required to be on because you were a solar owner, for example, batteries in this situation would step in during that expensive period and provide electricity to your home instead of your home pulling it from the grid at that higher rate. So over time, the batteries are paying for themselves because they are supporting that electricity cost instead of you buying it directly from the utility during that expensive period. So that's called time of use, and that's how storage fits in. So the two key ones here: reducing demand charges and time of use management. And then the next example here is in the case of places where the rate at which you're credited for your solar production is lowered, or in some cases removed, storage can help you keep the value of your solar array. So we've started to see this in different places, especially in areas where solar has a higher penetration. Utilities and public service commissions begin to adjust the rate at which the solar energy that leaves your home gets credited by the utility. So full net metering or full rate net metering means that if for any electricity that you're not using immediately in your home from your solar panels, when it passes through your meter, that's that number 4 here, you're getting a credit for that electricity. When that electricity leaves your house, you get the credit, and then when you use more later on, you use that credit. A lower rate means that when it leaves your house, you're not getting the same value as if you were to purchase the electricity from the utility. You're getting a lower value. The reasons why that happens, we can certainly talk about at the end, but in terms of the storage part of how that plays a role here is that if you're in this situation and you have a solar array on your roof, storage enables you to hold that electricity and to consume it all yourself later on, rather than having the excess solar during the day that you don't use go out to the grid. So you're doing what's called self-consumption. You're taking that electricity and you are keeping it for later and then using that valuable solar electricity you generated on site rather than sending it out to the grid and your neighbors and getting it credited at a lower rate. And then when we're talking about economic benefits, we do want to just reinforce, this quote here is from one of our members in Florida who decided to install storage. But we do want to reinforce that the value, that there is a value to resiliency as well. Even in situations where you're not getting economic value, like I described from the kilowatt hours, self-consumption, or demand charges or time of use, having storage does in fact have a value. And anybody who's ever lost their power for a number of days knows full well that it is not a free exercise. You're buying things, you might be staying at a hotel, heaven forbid you're in a place that you have medical equipment that needs to be powered and you need to leave your home to take care of that, or potentially even go to the hospital. These are all things that have value that are related to storage. They're harder to quantify, but we've seen, especially in areas like Florida, where we have a program that people really do connect with this and it means something to them and they're willing to invest in storage to be able to cover them in those situations because of that resiliency factor. All right, so let's scale it up a little bit here towards the end. We're gonna shift gears here and talk a little bit more about grid scale storage and then a little bit about equity as well. So what do I mean by grid scale storage? What you're looking at here is just a sample image I got from a Clean Technica article, but it's an example of some storage that is scaled up. Probably these are probably lithium-ion batteries as well that are grouped in large quantity to make a larger resource that is usable for utility purposes. Now, larger installations can be technologies other than batteries. We're seeing that a lot of them that are coming on in different parts of the country are, and actually across the world, are battery-based and are often lithium-ion based units. And a lot of times they are connected as smaller units, essentially assembled into larger groups. Not always, depending on the technology, but it's a very similar technology to what's used in the home. It's just done at a larger scale. This next point tied directly to the grid, not behind the meter. What that means is that the utility or a third party is operating that asset, and that asset is connected directly to the transmission grid or to the distribution grid. That means it's not in somebody's home, it's not in a business, it's not behind a meter that is a customer, it's a direct asset. Sorry about that. Now, this next point here, helping grid function, what this means is that the storage itself in this circumstance has a value to the utility company. Helping grid function means sometimes taking supply off of the grid, because as you may know, the grid needs to be in balance at all times. The amount of energy that's demanded by customers needs to be matched to the amount of energy that's produced, or vice versa. So storage is a way to help with that. It might absorb energy at key moments. It might inject energy at key moments. It might deal with issues of frequency and of keeping the signal that the utility is offering. That's the voltage and the frequency of the actual electricity provided, that it keeps it within range that is considered acceptable by standards that are enforced by the Public Service Commission. Storage is a way for them to do that, and it has a value. At grid scale, it also can provide backup services if it's put in a place where it can do that. And one of the examples of that is something called a microgrid. So you may have heard this term, but just like it sounds, it's a smaller version of the electric grid that can run by itself when the larger grid is unavailable. So it will have some sort of power generation This power generation could be a fossil fuel, which is like a common historic configuration of a microgrid, but it also might be a solar or wind source or a combination. And storage, when sited with solar and wind, can be a very effective way to create a microgrid situation where you're able to run some smaller area than the total grid for a community off of those assets. It might be within a residential community potentially, or a municipal district downtown. The boundaries vary in terms of their scale, but the idea is still the same. You're able to produce energy on a smaller scale, store it, and then run a set of homes or businesses or energy loads islanded or separated from the rest of the grid if there's a larger power failure. And in those situations, those values of resiliency also kick in. You are providing electricity and services to a community when the larger community might not have access to that, or be able to provide some resiliency in that situation. So that brings us to our next slide, which is talking about storage and equity. This is something that we've started to focus on a little bit more of late, which is as these projects come online, as utilities and public service commissions really struggle with where to site these projects, who gets to benefit from them, who owns them, should there be competition, and ultimately who's deriving the most benefit from them. So there's some standard thinking along those lines in public service commissions about ratepayer benefits and about the cost of a system and recovering those costs for utility. But the grid is changing. It's becoming more distributed. We have the technology to be able to locate assets in a variety of different places across the electricity grid. And that introduces the idea that there should be other parties that are potentially participating. Might be a third party. It might be a combination of residential homeowners who are being aggregated by a company to provide services from a lot of smaller units. So those battery backup systems that I showed you earlier, in the future, we might see hosts of them all coordinated together through software to be able to act together collectively as not one small unit, but as a much larger virtual unit. But regulations have to make that possible. When they're determining how to make that possible, we think it's important to consider not only those benefits that we typically look at from a utility, like the cost of electricity and the ratepayer benefits, but also non-energy benefits. Where should those microgrids and those storage assets be sited? Should there be additional value be placed on bringing resiliency to low and moderate income communities, or to communities that are likely to be impacted by climate change more than others? How does that get included into the conversation, which historically at the regulatory level has not considered those factors? And who should be pushing for that, and how does that work, right? So it's not just a matter of saying we want it here instead of there, but it's also, what are you for? And we think it's important to be for making these benefits available to everybody and to use that as part of the decision-making process. And there are ways that can already be, where individuals can already partake in that conversation, but it's difficult because this is a regulatory discussion, and oftentimes it's limited to industry and to utilities and to the policymakers and their legal representatives. So having the general public participate can often be a challenge. One term I do want to go over here before we jump off this, and this is mostly for definition purposes, is that there are processes out there called integrated resource planning, which have been around for a long time, where electricity grid planners and other stakeholders work together to identify and plan for where to put and where to site these energy options. So in states that have those integrated resource planning processes, it's potentially a good mechanism to introduce these concepts as well, of equity of location and resiliency benefits and non-energy benefits being part of that decision-making process. Coming down the home stretch here, we're going to just talk a little bit about resources, make sure that folks know where to find information. Oh, actually, one thing I forgot to mention on that previous slide is part of that discussion about where to locate resources is what was there before. So, for example, and this may have seen some of these examples in the news. A coal-fired power plant might be in a community and it's about to be sunsetted, right? It's going to be shut down. The utility and the Public Service Commission, the state, has to decide how to make up for that energy production. And in those situations, I think it's really important for advocates who are thinking about renewables and about storage to be positively for something that is a good replacement for that. So not just, we don't want that coal-fired power plant to be there anymore, but what should we use instead? And you start to see examples where that positive replacement, that idea, is starting to take hold. So, and just to give you one example, you might see, rather than building another plant, a combination of things replace that energy service that's being provided by that coal-fired power plant. It might be a combination of solar and wind. There might be storage included in there to be able to manage some of the intermittency. And there might be energy efficiency measures in there, as well as other residential or business focused measures to allow people to reduce their demand at key times. So software packages that do that. All of those things can be bundled together to be able to provide an alternative to potentially building another plant, or to push into the future an upgrade that might be needed now by adding those services. So these are things that weren't possible until in the last couple of years, and now that they're becoming possible because of the cost of storage coming down, because of solar and because of other software improvements, and as well as smart energy metering being more available, that becomes more of the conversation. What alternatives can we come up with that focus on distributed resources and add benefits in places where we want them to, and be able to replace an aging asset like a coal plant with something that's ready for the 21st century. On the resources side, a couple of projects, if folks are interested in kind of looking at places where some utilities have actually tried to encourage people to install batteries. There's just two on the screen here. If you want to, I think these slides will be available afterwards as well. Jacksonville is one that's is interesting, where the utility is offering an incentive for people to install storage. Same thing in the Sacramento Municipal Utility District, where they see that value and they're trying to encourage people to invest money by offering some financial benefit to install those storage units. And then coming back to the residential side, if people want to see more or learn more about residential storage, we have a residential storage guide that we released a couple of months ago, and it's available on our website. I'll have a link in the next slide here, and it really goes into a lot more detail into some of the topics we've talked about today. If anyone you know is thinking about storage and wants to get a good background on how these things function, this is a really great resource to direct them to. And that link there is for the storage guide, as well as some webinars that we recorded previously, similar to the one we just went through, with a little bit of extra detail in some of those areas. And we are certainly happy to take any questions that people have, not only here, but after. If you come to our website, solarunitedneighbors.org, there's a great way to stay informed. You're welcome to sign up for our newsletter. In states where we operate, which is up and down the East Coast, as well as Minnesota, now Colorado and Indiana, we have listservs available where people can join and be part of a conversation with other solar and storage advocates and owners. Very conversational, and a good place to post questions and share information in that state, not only about the technology side, but also about issues that are coming up on regulations or new laws. A good place to potentially organize as well. So we do encourage you to come check us out. We'd love to have you join our network and hear from us on not only storage, but also our solar work, as well as some of the work we're starting to do in community shared solar and in electric vehicles too. So with that, I will hand it back over. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Corey. That was wonderful and extremely informative. I really liked the part where you were talking about how solar storage can be used to supplement the grid on the utility scale. We had multiple questions come in where people want to know how much of what we've gone over applies to commercial as well.
Yeah, that's a good question. Quite a bit of it does in terms of the technology. I mean, obviously you're making it's at a larger scale for commercial, but the technology and the considerations for economics are often very similar. I will say, and I mentioned this briefly in the presentation, but businesses often already have demand charges. So in that situation, in adding storage is even more likely to have an economic benefit in more areas of the country because business demand charges are a much more common occurrence right now than residential.
Mm-hmm. Although I would imagine that residential with large number of units, such as an apartment building, might also have fairly high demand charges when everyone comes home from work and turns on the heat or the air conditioning and the oven and all of those things.
Yeah, that's probably true. Actually, I can't say I know for sure how common that charge structure is for multifamily buildings, but I wouldn't be surprised if that were also pretty prevalent.
Yes, we have a question from Lynn Mayer in Queens, New York. She would like to know whether solar and storage could be used to replace the generators in her high-rise apartment building, which has about 320 units. And they have 2 generators that are being used by that building. Could solar storage batteries take the place of those generators?
Without having specifics on the building, it's hard to tell, but I will say that for multifamily buildings that are high rises, the challenge isn't really the storage side, it's having enough surface space to be able to install enough solar to charge those batteries. So high-rise buildings often just don't have enough roof space to do that. It doesn't necessarily mean it's a no, but I'd expect that would probably be a challenge.
So maybe we need to wait for the PV technology to catch up. I've heard of glass windows that are also solar panels. That would be pretty cool.
Those someday those will happen. Those things tend to come slowly, but I'd encourage Lynn to talk to an installer and get some quotes and see whether it's possible because those things do vary by location.
Yep, and Lynn, we always begin with energy efficiency. So an energy efficiency assessment of your building will help with being able to meet the demand because your building will use less energy once the efficiency measures are put into place. So you'll more likely be able to supplement with battery and solar storage in that scenario. So we had some interesting news coming out recently. The largest battery system in the world went live last December, so a year ago, serving Southern Australia. And some of you may have heard of this. This was Elon Musk's big Tesla splash last year. And now 1 year out, we can look at the numbers and see how successful that was. So they installed 100 megawatts Tesla battery system, and it's known to have saved consumers nearly $40 million over the last 12 months and brought in an additional $24 million in revenue. Considering that Tesla was able to build the battery in only 54 days and at a cost of $66 million, there seems to be a very rapid return on investment for utility scale energy solution like this. Do you think that we'll be implementing anything like what Southern Australia has brought in the United States?
I do, and in some places in the country, I think that's already happening. It is very dependent on the revenue streams that the storage can generate for the owner, so the utility or whoever owns it, and those vary by what they call regional transmission operators or independent system operators. Those are kind of large transmission regions within the country. So the rules are changing a little bit there, but I do expect that will happen quite a bit. And the same is true, I think, at the local utility or distribution level. Just to give you an example, a number of states are doing grid modernization proceedings. One of them, Maryland, where I used to do more work, their working group specifically on this issue has developed a proposal that's under consideration by the commission on what these different models can look like in Maryland. How do they generate revenue? Are they going to produce ratepayer benefits in several different kind of model or example structures of who owns them and how they're deployed? So utilities and public service commissions across the country are really looking at this. And as they do, it's really important to keep asking those questions. Who needs to own it? Can we have competition? And who should benefit? But yeah, it's all coming, and it's coming soon.
That's great news. We have some questions about electric vehicles. Let's see here. Michael Benson would like to know whether PV storage and batteries can be used to support electric vehicle fast charging.
Fast charging in a home is going to be like what they call level 2 charger, is a 240 volt outlet. So as long as you have that outlet, you're going to be able to support that in your home. The interaction with the solar and the storage is more about how much of the electricity, especially for solar, is provided to your home, including that charger, from renewables. They're not necessarily closely linked, although there is at least one inverter company, SolarEdge, who makes a charging unit that's part of their solar inverter. So it's still level 2, but they kind of boost it in certain situations. And don't have a lot of experience with that unit, but I know that they're trying to make those connections. So maybe a little bit of a muddled answer, but the short answer is it's not a direct connection, but they all kind of live together. And we see often that EV owners are solar owners. There's a lot of crossover there in those two communities.
So I guess a more simplified question would be, can the batteries hold enough charge to charge your car?
In most cases, the answer would be no, because that would be a pretty large bank. I think that would be required. Can they do some topping off? Probably, but again, the sizing of the system is going to vary based on what else you want to run in the home. So if you're including that electric charger in that calculation, the installer is going to size it appropriately, and then it probably becomes a question of, do you have space for those batteries, and what's the budget?
Certainly. And that brings a lot of questions about the batteries themselves. Now, the Tesla batteries are lithium ion, and I know many of the more sleek and popular versions are lithium ion as well. Now, lithium ion batteries are the same kind of battery that you use for your laptop or your phone. Do you need to operate them in the same manner? Do you need to run down your battery and then recharge it the same way that you do with your phone in order to optimize the functionality of the battery?
There's certainly, I think, preferred ways of charging and discharging to add some life to the batteries, and that's true for lithium ion as well. I hesitate to give you kind of a broad answer, because it's probably going to depend on the chemistry and on the manufacturer. But whoever's designing those and offering those should be able to give that guidance. I will say, just to, because I didn't mention during the presentation, there's a couple different types of lithium ion batteries too. So folks who are evaluating, there's what they call lithium ion NMC, excuse me, which is nickel manganese cobalt oxide, for kind of a long name. And that's the one you see in a lot of consumer electronics. And that also, in some situations, has issues with what they call thermal runaway, where if it's not charged properly, it can be a safety hazard. Battery storage systems are designed to avoid that, and we haven't really seen any problems with that. But if you see that kind of communication stories, that's the technology that typically is involved with that. And then the other version is lithium ferrophosphate, or that version tends to be a little more stable, but the cost is also higher. So some different chemistries out there. It's important to ask questions and decide, what is important to you. But again, we haven't seen a lot of issues related to that in the storage market. In consumer electronics and smaller units, but potentially those issues have come up before, like hoverboards and e-cigarettes, that kind of thing, because that technology is very similar.
Mm-hmm. And we have some people who are curious about the vehicle to grid connection. So you mentioned that a lot of people who have solar have EVs. Can you talk a little bit about how those work together?
Yeah, so vehicle to grid, I'm assuming meaning using the vehicle to either charge the home in situations where the power is out, or even interact with the grid directly to provide services. The two separate categories. One, on the battery backup side, I've heard of people doing it, but you definitely want to check with your manufacturer, because using the car to power your house in a grid outage potentially will void your car warranty. But people have done it. And then on the other side, the grid services side, that is much newer. I don't have a lot of information on that, but I know that that gets discussed a lot, especially in the context of fleet vehicles. So vehicles that are being charged at night, like buses and other large vehicles, where they're kind of a stationary collective battery bank that can be used for economic value. So there's definitely a lot of work being done there, but I don't have much more info on that, unfortunately.
So very much an emerging technology currently.
Yep.
Okay, that's good to know. Now, the idea of using solar for resiliency in your home is very interesting. If you were to have a storm, that would cause a power outage, like a hurricane or a major snowstorm, would you be able to use your battery, or the standard in-home size, to power your air conditioning or your heat?
At a whole house air conditioning unit, most likely not. That's a pretty big unit. We've certainly have had people ask and want to do that. It's mostly a function of budget, but also of power. So the short answer is probably not there. For heat, it depends on the kind of heat. If it's a resistive heat unit, like a heat pump, probably not. If you have a fossil fuel-based heat system like oil or natural gas, you're really just talking about circulating air, forced air, or circulating liquid through a radiator system. Those pumps could probably be run off of a battery backup system. So it's going to vary by home. For the air conditioning side, most likely you're powering a window unit as an alternative, or maybe a standing plug-in unit rather than the whole house, because of the amount of power it requires to run it.
Certainly. And I'm afraid we're out of time. So you can see our contact information here if you have any questions. Please don't hesitate to reach out if your question didn't get answered in the time that we had allotted. We really value everyone who made time in their very busy day and in this holiday season to learn about clean energy technologies and how solar battery storage works. And thank you so much to Corey Ramsden, who has been very generous with his time and his support of Solar United Neighbors. They really are a wonderful organization, and I recommend that you check out their website. For everyone that registered, there will be a recording that is circulated after the event. And in the meantime, thank you so much for joining us, and happy holidays.